Once in a while, I highly recommend a book. Today, I'm going to focus on this one, The Road Less Traveled. Now, Scott Peck wrote this a few decades ago. He actually wrote it before he became captured by one religion. He did some exploration, eventually became a Christian, but his book reflects some very deep roots. In this book, Peck makes a few quotes, a few comments early on that I think are worthwhile to explore. So I'm going to take the liberty to read a little bit of this for you and make a few comments on it. As we go along, we'll try to maybe develop a little more of the book and some of the key concepts. If I were to recommend one book on the topic of psychological formation or soul development or spiritual formation, those things are all tied together. The Road Less Traveled would be, I think, the one book I would recommend. Now, the principles are all contained in the scriptures, but somehow, at times in the scriptures, people get lost because of metaphors, the historical setting at the time the scriptures were written, so different from now. Peck does a good job of taking critical principles and boiling them down into one volume. And what he does masterfully is combine psychology, theology, psychotherapy, character development, a whole raft of core ideas that are useful. So I'm going to start out with this session just reading a few quotes from The Road Less Traveled. As a psychiatrist, I feel it is important to mention at the outset two assumptions that underlie this book. One is that I make no distinction between the mind and the spirit, and therefore no distinction between the process of achieving spiritual growth and achieving mental growth. They are one and the same. If he is correct, we can stop fussing over some kind of artificial distinction between spirituality and psychological development. He brings them together. The other assumption is that this process is a complex, arduous, and lifelong task. Psychotherapy, if it is to provide substantial assistance to the process of mental and spiritual growth, is not a quick or simple procedure. I do not belong to any particular school of psychiatry or psychotherapy. I am not simply a Freudian or Jungian or Adlerian or behaviorist or gestaltist. I do not believe there are any single answers. I believe that brief forms of psychotherapy may be helpful and are not to be decried, but the help they provide is inevitably superficial. The journey of spiritual growth is a long one. Now, this is coming from a man whose very livelihood, the thing that he has devoted himself to educationally and in his work, and he is saying that what he does professionally is superficial. I would look at it this way, that what good psychotherapists do are practice a few basic principles and practices with their clients. And if these clients will learn these principles and practices and then continue to do them with one or two friends throughout their life, they can continue to heal the wounded little kid inside and grow into a human being with greater and greater quality character, therefore greater mental health. Now, Peck speaks a lot about the issue of suffering. Suffering happens. Life is painful, and when we experience something that is painful, we suffer. The question is not whether we're going to encounter something painful, and the question is not, are we going to suffer? Some would say that you can set aside suffering if you can just detach from any need to do otherwise. What Peck talks about, and I believe is true, is that suffering need not be a negative thing if we learn how to suffer in a healthy way. And that's what Peck is addressing in this book, The Road Less Traveled. This is a worthwhile purchase for you and a worthwhile read. My copy is pretty messed up, and I'm going back to it now, years and years later, rereading, because when I first read it 30 years ago, I was not in a place to absorb some of the concepts as well as I am now. So, Peck says that there are 4 qualities or character traits to be developed if we are to suffer well, which he calls techniques of suffering. An interesting term, techniques of suffering well, which he equates with mental health and spiritual health. Here they are. Delaying of gratification, acceptance of responsibility, dedication to truth, and balance, or balancing. We're going to explore each of these in a little more depth in succeeding videos. They are tied in with a series that I'm developing. It's actually a 3-year series that I'm developing, built around the early life of Jesus, his entrance into ministry, the Sermon on the Mount, and the 46 parables that he taught, plus a host of other scriptures throughout Scripture and from other resources that all tie in to some of the same principles and concepts. Actually, if we mastered the Sermon on the Mount, we would understand what Scott Peck is writing about. If we understand what he is writing about, it will give us great insight into the mastery of the things that Jesus taught. The Road Less Traveled, a worthwhile investment, and an even more worthwhile investment of your time and mental energy. Have a good day.